Welcome back to part 4 of our 4-part series on the 4 things that make a successful and a sustainable academic writer. And number 4 on that list was the fact that these academics are engaged in constant improvement of their writing skills. So I think it's important to really make clear that academic writers, even the really successful ones, even the really senior scholars, do not reach a sort of writing nirvana where they suddenly, they've hit their limit of self-improvement when it comes to writing. It is a constant endeavor to improve your writing, and that's why I call it a writing practice. And even the best writers are still trying to be better, and they are really consciously trying to improve their writing craft when they are writing. And I think that's something that's not perhaps appreciated by everybody, and certainly not junior level academics. So even really great writers are constantly trying to evolve and improve their writing practice. And this is a fundamental characteristic of really successful academics. So how do they do this? Yes, they invest time and sometimes, oftentimes, money in order to improve writing skills. Now, I'm going to have a close eye here on the actual writing itself, but of course, making sure that you have the time available to you to do your writing requires you to obviously develop other areas of your job as well. So it's not, these things are all interrelated. It's not just writing in isolation, but let's just talk about writing for a moment. So academics who are successful and sustainable and good writers will absolutely spend time investing in their writing craft. And by that, I mean technically upskilling. They will be consistently seeking to improve the way they execute. So every piece they write, they are going to have an eye on how well they have executed the technical craft of writing. Okay, so they are actually looking at the technicalities of, the turn of phrase, the sentence construction, the way in which they have actually communicated this idea, and how close or indeed how far away it is from the original idea that they had in their head. So successful writers are always looking at the craft of writing and trying to learn how to get better at it. And they might have a writing coach. They might be reading books about writing. They might be trying to do it through imitation of other writers. But however they're doing it, they're doing it. They might not be talking about it with you, especially if you're a junior academic and they're a more senior academic person, but they are consistently trying to do a better job in how they communicate their ideas to the readership. So they absolutely spend time on the craft itself. Another place that academic writers who want to improve spend time is, of course, more holistically managing their job as a whole in order to create the time and space that they need to do their writing. And in that case, they might have mentors, they might have coaches. They definitely heavily invest time in strategy, pipeline construction, making very conscious choices about the kinds of projects they're going to be involved in and not involved in, because all of these things have an effect on your actual skill of writing. Okay, different projects require different skill sets in terms of delivery of the outcome, and some projects won't actually push you very much on writing. Report writing, for example, is a much easier and simpler skill set to master than journal article writing. which is very heavily gate kept. There's specific formulas. It's a very limited word count. There's all kinds of things going on there in a journal article where that really pushes your writing skills, because there's so many rules in place that constricts how you're going to communicate your idea. So there are so many different things that good writers think about in organizing their job and their career, so that they are thinking strategically about how to improve their writing skills. They're going to take on new and different writing techniques, because each technique brings with it a different type of writing. And every genre that you're writing is only going to improve your skills overall. So they move around different genres of writing, and they are enabling that by making good strategic choices. So they're going to write a book, they're going to write on blogs, they're going to write public consultation papers, works in progress, working paper series, journal articles, report writing, policy documents, whatever it is. They'll engage in journalistic pieces. They'll engage in all of these different writing techniques, because every time you switch technique, you're improving your skill set, right? You're improving the way in which you execute writing. Another way in which you can invest in your writing improvement sort of skills is by developing thinking and ideation skills. Good writing flows from great ideation. If you are poor in the ideation phase of writing, ultimately the writing is not as sharp and clear as it could have been had you been able to ideate your project at the beginning much more clearly. So when you do not have a fully thought through project piece of writing, and you start writing anyway, you have to write and overwrite and rewrite, and then you become committed to certain bits of text that don't work because you think they sound beautiful and you won't cut them, and it muddies the idea. And there's a whole circle of hell that you sink into. And that's all, it can all be drawn back to the fact that you didn't clearly know what you were doing in the first place, but you set off writing right to think. I've already done a podcast episode on that, so you know what I feel about that. So if you're not ideating well, writing is garbled. But if you ideate clearly, the writing is much easier to execute. So developing the skill of thinking through your projects and your pieces of writing before you begin writing is a really critical skill in the constant improvement of your writing, because the better you are earlier on in the process, the better the final outcome will be. You will spend less time rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, and more time really being able to work on the craft of language, because you'll have the space and time to do that, because you'll have executed the idea much more easily if you've thought it through at the beginning. So that is something I note with a lot of writers. They're not just constantly looking at the language craft they're trying to improve, but they're also trying to, they get clearer and clearer and clearer at the beginning of the writing in terms of what they want to execute. And that helps the final writing come out much more clearly. Also, writers who are wanting to constantly upskill their writing spend time on nurturing collaboration. And there's lots of reasons for this. There's intellectual reasons, obviously, to collaborate. But there's also something in the collaboration process where you can really see other people's early writing. You can really learn from each other if it's a good collaboration in terms of how you execute writing and the way in which you describe things and the way in which you have certain turns of phrases, right? So a good collaboration can really help accelerate your writing development, as long as you're internalizing those lessons and it's not just like a one-hit wonder. Okay, well, when I collaborated with this person, it all came out brilliant, and then when I went back on my own, I learned nothing and I just went back to my old habits. Obviously that doesn't help. But if you're actually trying to internalize what you learn from this collaboration in terms of the writing craft, that also helps you upskill and improve your writing over time. The best way to improve your writing, and I think this is common to people who are prolific writers, who write a lot, and who are very good writers, they read a lot. They read and read and read and read. They are voracious readers. And this is important for all kinds of reasons. Okay, reading, it's a dying skill. Spending time with a book is a dying skill, right? Not scrolling Instagram, but instead concentrating on something difficult does so many things for your brain. From a neuroscience point of view, it does so many things. It enables you to really exercise the muscle of deep concentration and focus, which makes the act of writing much easier. But of course, the main benefit of reading is just the consuming of language, and learning new ways in which to express things, new vocabulary. And that makes writing concisely and accurately so much easier because you have a wide vocabulary to draw on. And people who really struggle with writing, in my experience, don't read as much as other people. And I'm not just talking here about academic books, okay? I'm not just talking about journal articles. Of course, that's part of it, academic works. But I'm just talking about reading more generally, like whether it's, my personal favorite, horror and, crime. I love a good body count and a car chase, right? In my books. It can be also very intellectual work, which I also read. But, I also read a load of writing books, right? Books about writing. So I read widely and voraciously. And I'm always telling my clients, like, I've read 3 books this week. And they're like, where do you get the time? I read all the time. I read at lunchtime. I'm reading over breakfast. I'm constantly reading. And because of that, I'm learning new words every day. I'm learning language. I'm learning all kinds of things that I'm sort of subconsciously internalizing that I then get to use in my own writing. And that is one of the biggest ways that you can really upgrade the quality of your work. Now, the downside to that is, of course, reading is time consuming, and reading academic papers, especially if they're boring, takes a long time and a lot of concentration. I'm not arguing with that. That's just an actual reality. But there's no shortcut to this. Actually reading and thinking about the language when you're reading. It's one of those things that a lot of my clients say to me once they have been through my training process. They start to read books and papers, and they start to become a critic of the writing. They start to see really great writing and how it's constructed, and then they start to see really sloppy writing. And it's quite funny, like, they always report back to me, I found myself reading this paper and thinking, there's no topic sentence there. They because they're not only now reading for content, but they're developing the skill to read for technique. And that's a gift because you're constantly teaching yourself how to improve your writing, what works, what doesn't. You really start to recognize it in other people's writing, published work. So reading a lot, whether it's academic work or not academic work, can only ever help your writing technique, your vocabulary, your grammar, all of the things. So, and that is a work of constant improvement, right? You're always reading and reading for technique as well as reading for content. And that's something you can do for the rest of your career and will do for the rest of your career. So yeah, it's a 2-for-1. You can read for the content, but you can also read for the technique of execution. And we all come across papers where, it's the papers that are very easy to read. These are the ones that is the technique you want to mimic. But the ones that you've had to struggle through and it feels like, you're skiing uphill on ice. It's like wading through treacle. It's painful. They're just really badly written papers. Badly written papers get published all the time, but the ones where you zip through them like that, wow, they have been written beautifully and well and with a lot of care. And that's the technique that you want to kind of take a moment to look at that paper and think, how have they executed that it was so easy for me to get what I needed from it? That's the technique you want to be mimicking. So yes, I can't say that enough. Reading is so important. Reading widely, reading voraciously is the best way to improve your writing technique. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the time invested in thinking about the quality of the idea and then the execution of it, which is the actual writing, but starting much earlier and thinking about the kind of idea that you're going to deliver. What should be happening is as you progress through your career, as you get more and more and more experienced, you will go through writing very simple projects, which at the time that you're doing them feel very challenging. But later on in your career, you're going to look back and think, that wasn't that hard, right? Because you're challenging yourself to move on to more and more complex ideas. And as you move on to more and more complex ideas, which involve more and more literature, you have more and more knowledge, cross disciplines, you require ever more sophisticated techniques of writing in order to execute ever more complexity in your ideas. So as your ideas progress, the complexity in your technique of writing needs to progress with it. Otherwise, there is a gap between your very complex idea and what you ultimately end up putting on the paper. Now, I will always say that there is always going to be a gap between what's in your head and what appears on the paper, and what another person interprets that to mean. And your job as the writer is to bring all of those as close together as you can so that what appears on paper is as close to what was in your mind as possible. Now, obviously, fantasy, reality, it's never quite matches up as we might like it to. But the closer and closer you get, that indicates a better and better writing technique. Writing is the technique of communicating your idea. So if what you had in your head is very far away from what ends up on the paper, then something went wrong in the execution of that idea, right? So either the idea was nonsense, which you found out later, hopefully not if you're doing proper ideation, or the technique wasn't up to executing the complexity of the idea. And then that's an indication I really need to work on that technique. It's very frustrating to me. I'm going to moan now. It's very frustrating to me as a writing coach when I see the amazing ideas that my clients have, and they can verbalize them and they can really get into the complexity of them. But then there's some kind of chasm that it falls down before it gets to the paper. And then what is rendered on the paper doesn't quite match the complexity of what they were trying to say. And that's technique, right? That's sometimes the idea is just too big. And I'll talk about that in other podcast episodes. But a lot of the time it is a technique issue. And so it's really important as you go through your career and you move from simpler projects earlier in your career to more and more and more and more complex projects, that your technique moves with you. Yeah. So if I talk about that from a law perspective, for example, it's very easy to write a case note. It's a very simple technique. It's a standard lawyer fare. You write up a case note for a journal. It's a very limited word count. It's a very simple technique, very easy to execute. That is very different from having a new conceptual framework for thinking about X, Y, and Z with 3 different literatures from 3 disciplines. Different complexity of material, and a different technique is required to execute it, a more sophisticated technique, right? So I just want you to think about that. I want you to think about the time you invest in the idea needs to reflect also the time you invest in the execution of that idea. So people who get published in the top journals, who have quite complex ideas, usually have the best writing technique. They are able to communicate them well because those 2 things have developed in tandem, right? Their complexity of their ideas has also developed with their writing technique. So these are the characteristics, I think, that successful and sustainable and really great academic writers have, and that these are the different facets of constant improvement that they are engaging with. Some of these you can do by yourself. Some of these I suggest require maybe some help, some coaching, some mentorship in order to help you along the way. But there is something here for everybody to work on. And if you only just pick one of these things to get started on, I think that would really help developing your writing for the stage that you are at currently in your academic career.